Sorry.
All right, so this is what you're all here for, right? So what we're going to do, first of all, I'm not Bill.
Woohoo! now that's Bill.
Woo-hoo. Bill is not here tonight. He's in sunny Hawaii, I think. I don't know. He's out somewhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the middleware first. That's with Chris. And then we're going to do ASP.NET Core Web API. And if we have enough time, we'll add some swagger to it and play with that. So that's what's going on. This is the meetup site that you see up here. You obviously have gotten here because you're here, so you know where it is. Inside that site, there should be some information. Hopefully you've all set up your systems and downloaded all the right stuff. And if not, start doing it now. I guess you're going to use something out of GitHub. Is that what you do?
I will, but it doesn't require you to know.
Okay. So that's that. We have, while I'm here, we have this meeting. Next meeting is
2 weeks from today.
2 weeks from today. Kids Can Code. Yes.
Yeah, 2 weeks from today, Kids Can Code. I know a lot of people are in the habit of signing up for whatever the meeting is. You'll notice that our Kids Can Code meetup is quote unquote sold out, and I'm going to admit to being a little skeptical that those are all going to be kids seats. So I think it's fair to say that we would like the RSVPs to be for kids that will be sitting in these seats. It doesn't mean you can't cover them. It's just we want the head count for them. And yes, they do need to bring a laptop. And I think, in fact, I know for both of the, I guess I should stand over here. For both of them, both of our sessions, one is aimed at younger kids using Scratch. Others aimed at older kids building their first websites with HTML, CSS. Windows and Mac is supported. I even think for the older kids one, you could technically bring a Chromebook, but we're not calling it supported, even though I think it would work, which is something that I kind of want to look into in the future for older kids workshops, because I know many high schools in our region are one-to-one Chromebooks, so it's something we're trying to keep in mind. So yeah, definitely, we'd love to have you here. We'd love you to spread the word to family members or whether they're immediate family or other folks that maybe you go to school with, especially girls and boys interested in STEM, that we have this, and then we'll see what we can do about trying to get the attendees right, because we don't need it to be sold out quite yet. It will not be streamed or recorded. The next streaming recording session will be the next hands-on lab, and that's merely because we really didn't want to fuss with the ideas of getting permission and being courteous about parents or guardians concerned about their kids being on camera. So we said, hey, we're just going to have a meeting for us and for them, and we'll enjoy that next time in 2 weeks.
Right, and there's one more thing that the kids have to bring besides their laptop and the other stuff, and that is a parent or a guardian.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thank you. It is not a drop-off event. That's right, and that's really important. State of Pennsylvania, if we had that sort of event, then there are certain certifications we have to file, which we could do, but we've chosen not to. So it is not a drop-off event. You do have to remain with them.
Yep. So that's in 2 weeks. And then after that is the next hands-on lab, and I think we're talking about SignalR. Okay, SignalR is that one. And then 15 minutes of fame after that. So that's what's going on for the next couple weeks, months, whatever. And why don't we get you up here and get you set up so you can get started. And why does it say showing you? That scares me.
Is that your laptop?
No.
That was the system. Oh, good.
Yeah, it says shutting down.
It's
Oh, it's starting Windows.
And it's not just Windows, it's Windows 7. What? That's not any Windows 10 I'm used to.
No.
Did they stop you with child building?
No, this thing here, this spread request that handles this stuff. Hey, it's not XP. What do you mean? Anybody going to the store or the mall or the doctor's office have read and seen Windows XP? Because I sure have. I had this. I hate to tell you where I
Chris, give me a second to start up, all right?
Yeah. Do you know that this restaurant rebooted?
No,
The little tablet right here, it rebooted.
All right.
So.
Who's getting an update?
Yeah, got a Windows update. Now, speaking of rebooting, is my laptop going to start up? Good, good. 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 And it's that guy over there. Okay. No problem. Please silence your cell phones before the movie begins, right? Yeah, especially if you are the movie. Oh, the other thing I gotta do is get this guy on the network. Yeah. Thank you. Let me know if you can't hear me. I'm really awful with these mics still. Certainly no movie star. Yeah, and then I guess I could do that here, right? Lights here, environment. Or Rich. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, so trying out something tonight it's not really going to affect the lab. Everything should be the same. But Philly.net does have a GitHub account, a GitHub organization. And as you can see, there's a couple repositories in there. One of them was for last month, one of them for this month. I want to promise you all that if you expect the repositories to remain totally backward compatible, that's probably not going to be the case, because in 2 years we would have 24 repositories. So there may be some shifting around as we figure out a good way to organize this stuff. And another thing is we're going to learn how to do this. We're going to learn how to take good advantage of GitHub for hands-on labs. So nothing here needs to be, there's nothing to be downloaded. You could type everything, but I think you probably will want to do some cut and paste. So I do recommend taking the time now to going to github.com/philly.net, Philly, D-O-T-N-E-T, and you will see the 2 repositories. And I'll show this again. It's github.com/philly.net, Philly, D-O-T-N-E-T. And if you click on what should be for everybody, the top repository, which that stands for Hands-On Lab for 2018 June, and then just in case there was a second, so we didn't run into each other, I slapped middleware on the back of it. The key here is the code we can cut and paste from this README file, and I believe this will be very cut and paste friendly. I know we've struggled with this in the past. The PDF doesn't blah, blah, blah. Maybe from a website, it's a picture. Oh my gosh! And so let's try. We're going to try this out as we go, but I'm going to walk through it too. So this should be everything that we're doing. So I would say go ahead while I'm getting started here, and make sure you're at github.com/philly.net, Philly, D-O-T-N-E-T, and select the top repository with the middleware _middleware, so that you'll have this stuff. We're going to do everything in Visual Studio Code just because it's quick, and that's not what I was looking for. it's quick, and we don't have to worry about maybe somebody didn't quite get a Visual Studio Community installed. What I'm looking for, I want to show you a picture, which of course it's going to take me the third or fourth to find. Here we go. So let's talk about what middleware is. If you've been to the previous hands-on labs, you've probably seen Rob or Bill very briefly did a little bit of magic in the startup CS file. Maybe they added a .useMVC, or maybe to make sure that their website displayed static files in the www root folder, they added a use static files. Each of those pieces, every time you saw those app.use extension methods, which we're going to see live, you were adding to the ASP.NET Middleware Pipeline. So this is a feature of ASP.NET Core. I'm going to say that it is unique to ASP.NET Core in that if you come from .NET Framework, ASP.NET 4 and greater, you didn't have to configure necessarily a pipeline to use MVC or to use web forms. Later technologies, such as SignalR and WebAPI, either optionally or was mandatory, used something that's going to look really similar, which was called the OIN pipeline. And so if you really got into that stuff, you're going to see that this middleware pipeline is heavily inspired by the success of OIN. But I think it's fair to say that most of us who used OIN in the .NET framework in ASP.NET 4, we probably didn't even realize we were using it, because really it was just the documentation said, make sure you go here and make sure you come here and you use SignalR or use WebAPI. So we didn't stop to think, like, well, what is this OIN pipeline? So when we get into the code, you're going to see that the way it works is you layer middleware in order. The order is important. And so in the diagram you see on the screen now, a request comes in and it is sent to middleware 1, which has the freedom to act on it however it wishes. It receives the HTTP context, which is going to include things like the headers. It's going to include the cookies. It's also going to include the body of the request, the URL, query string, and anything you would need in order to figure out what to do next. Then each piece of middleware passes along control to the next piece of middleware by calling the next function in the pipeline. It doesn't actually have to know what that next function is. Are you serious? It not only screened and not only went dark, it beat me all the way to sleep. So I gotta, first of all, change those settings, and second of all, not get beaten again. All right, so the race is on, computer. Okay, so what you're going to see here is that in this particular example on the screen, there's some logic, call the next function. That next function is passed to each piece of middleware, so it doesn't have to know how the person configured it, how the implementer configured it. It just knows, okay, I got somebody to call next. And eventually, you're going to finish the end of the pipeline, and ASP.NET comes back the other way, presumably so that you can act on outgoing responses. So the thinking is you act on incoming requests, and then after you call the next method, you actually can write more code and act on the outgoing response. There are other things you can do. You can short circuit this evaluation. You can actually do whatever you want. It's code. But what you're going to see here is a simple example that I think will help you understand what your options are in this pipeline. And that hopefully will make it easier when you use the standard middleware, which is just things like use MVC or use authentication, things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a command prompt, which I'm going to have to make a little bit bigger here. Is that good? Does it need to be bigger? Go ahead and up the font size just a little bit here. Okay. Now, in order to get started, everybody's going to want to make sure that man, I can't even type on this keyboard. Make sure that you have the .NET.exe, which means you installed the ASP.NET Core SDK. And I think for tonight, it would be okay if you didn't have 2.1, like if you didn't have the latest and greatest from last week. But if you have 2 or above, you should be fine. Yeah, you'll need 2.1 for ROBs anyway, so, and it's pretty quick to install. So in any case, what we'll do is everyone can see if I head back over to GitHub, and some of you, you might feel free to go ahead and start moving along, right? Is we're going to start things off by creating, in a folder that you wish, we're going to create a new empty web project. Okay, so it's .NET, D-O-T-N-E-T, space new. The command new means I want a new project. The template is called web. And then my addition of -o middleware is saying, don't create the project right here in this folder. Make a subfolder, middleware, and go create the project there. And again, you should be able to follow along on this README if for some reason I get ahead, or maybe you just want to try things another way. You can also do this in Visual Studio. It'll work just fine. You'll do File, New Project, and pick an empty web project. You don't want anything else, because we're just going to blow away everything in startup anyway, or we're going to ignore most of it or use it for learning purposes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to my command line and clear this. And I want to show you that if I say .NET new and I say -- help, I'll get a listing of the templates. Now that went really fast, but if I scroll up a little bit, here are the listing of templates installed for me. This is useful because I wanted the empty ASP.NET Core, so I follow along from left to right. The short name of it is web. By default, it's going to be in C#, but look at this, F# fans, I can get an F# version, and you get an empty web project. Here are all the other types, and this might look familiar to you if you're coming from Visual Studio. It's the same project types, right? That's pretty cool. So we're getting this kind of automatable way of doing work by using one source for everything instead of in the past, the tooling team had to do this and whatever. I won't promise you that's exactly how it works, but I know that that's the goal. So I'm going to type in the same thing, .NET new web -o middleware. And the first thing that you get for free now in .NET Core 2 and above is automatic .NET restore. So it automatically went out to NuGet and grabbed all the packages that were needed. And then all I have to do to get to the project is switch over to the middleware folder. So I'm going to clear the screen again just so we can see that up there. So I'm in that middleware folder. I could take a quick peek at it. And not much going on in here. What I am going to do, though, is start Visual Studio Code in here. And I like to do that from the command line very simply with a code and a dot, current directory. So how's everybody doing? Everybody's got your project ready? Go ahead and get Visual Studio Code up. Here is Visual Studio Code. Whoops. All right. That a little bit bigger. Now, a lot of you may have seen, if you're going to need the C# extension installed. If you don't have it installed, Visual Studio Code should yell at you right now and get it installed pretty quickly. If it is installed, it recognizes that you don't have Visual Studio Code's magic files, launch.json and task.json, in order for its debugger to kick in and its builder to kick in. So I'm going to just say, yeah, go ahead, make those for me. And we're not going to need to worry about these. They're fine for tonight. They're perfectly fine. They work great. So when we talk about middleware, we are talking about startup.cs. So when you get a chance, go ahead and open that file. We aren't going to concentrate on all the methods here tonight. The main one for middleware is configure. This is the pipeline. This is it. And in an empty project, it's a very simple pipeline. First of all, it just asks if we are in debug mode, which it figures out a couple of ways. It's a layered approach. You can either just flat out set it as an environment variable, or you could put it in a configuration file of some kind. You can actually configure how you configure that too. It's extremely extensible. If you said, I love any files, then you could add some middleware here that would read configuration from any files and then move down the pipeline after that. So all we really did is just said that if we're in the development environment, we want to add a step to the pipeline called use developer exception page. This is something from Microsoft that basically detects if an exception was thrown during this process and shows you what we used to affectionately call the yellow screen of death. I don't think it's yellow now. Is it blue again? Yeah, it's the same thing though. But now we get to do something cool. We can write in code that we only want it to come out in development instead of like, well, is that in config? Is it in code? And then we're using a method called run that basically, this is it. This is the whole app. All it does is get the HTTP context and writes out a response of hello world. This isn't even really HTML, right? So this is an extremely simple pipeline. And run is a method on iApplication Builder, which is passed into us. So what you do is you use the methods of iApplication Builder to construct this pipeline. And run is something you're pretty much always going to put at an endpoint. And the reason why? Run does not get the next parameter. It doesn't get who's next in the pipeline. Thought I shut you off. I probably had to like log in to shut off or something. So if you are a little uncomfortable with Lambda expressions, what run takes as a parameter is a function. It takes a function. In fact, we can just hover over it and see what it takes. It needs a delegate that meets the requirements of request delegate, and if we went and looked that up, it's a function that takes an HTTP context, an ASP.NET HTTP context. So we are just supplying that function right here in line. We're saying here's a function that takes a context, so parameter of context, and what do I want you to do? Well, I want you to asynchronously write out this response and then return that implicitly, because Lambda expressions, if they're one-line expressions, implicitly have a return keyword right there. It's just hidden. You don't see it. If you've been in JavaScript, you're doing arrow functions. Looks really similar. And this kind of syntax has made its way to all the mainstream languages. So it's okay if you don't like it. It takes some getting used to. You could replace this with a full-blown delegate or function. So that would be your choice. But now let's see, what are we going to do in this lab? So we've created the new web project, and I opened the folder in Visual Studio Code. I did it by doing code dot. You could do it any way you want. We're going to start off by making what's called a middleware delegate. We're basically just saying, here's a step in the pipeline, and it's going to be in line, right? It's going to be an inline step in the pipeline. So between, according to the instructions here, we're going to add this middleware delegate between the if block and the app.run block. We're using a different method called use, and here's where I get to test out live how this is all going to work. So copy straight from GitHub. This is this is the future here, I hope. Here we go. And then when you hate the formatting, then you say, okay, Visual Studio Code, Alt-Shift-F, and fix that for me. So what have I done in this pipeline? I've said, okay, we're going to ignore the if block. It's not super relevant for us tonight, but the first thing we're going to do is we are going to add a header called Philly.net with a value of hands-on lab and call the next function. That's it. I know that doesn't sound super useful, but the idea is let's do the most basic thing we possibly can. And I kind of wanted to do something different than writing out a different response. And the reason why, once you write a response, if you try to write to the response again, the pipeline throws an exception. So try to keep your context.response writing in run, the ends of the pipeline. So I figured, well, I got to do something else, so let's write a header. So, and then it calls the next function. Now that's a responsibility I have when you use the use method. If you don't do that, it's called short-circuiting, and that'll be the end of the pipeline right there. So you do have a responsibility to call the next function. This was passed to you. If you're familiar with the func and action, this is a func of task. It was passed to us. And what is it really? Well, it's this next one. That the pipeline takes care of that. But we do get the context, which I'm modifying. So let's go ahead. If you've got this code in here, in your Visual Studio Code, you should be able to use the debug window and hit the little triangle. And it might come up on my other screen, and I'll drag it over if it does. We get a really simple looking app. Super simple. Just says hello world. Really basic. But what I'm going to do to find that header is I'm going to hit F12. I'm in Edge. This should be pretty similar in all the browsers. And it's not, it's just because I haven't changed my default browser. Believe I'm not shilling for Edge here. So I hit F12, the network tab. I see my request. And I click on it, and here I have a headers tab. Down here in response headers, I have Philly.net hands-on lab. So that little bit of code added that response header. How'd that go for everybody? Good? Good. I'll go back to the code. Yep. Let's go back to the code. Let's move that out of the way. This is what we added from 27 to 33, which you should also be able to cut and paste from the README. I understand, though, that it's kind of nice, you know, if you cut and paste tonight, you know, you go and type and all the IntelliSense pops up, and it really drives home what's going on, I think. So I like to type the stuff in too. We have some bigger tech code blocks later, though. So now I'll bring this code back, but what I want to show is that if you are cutting and pasting, go ahead and add this method to the startup class. I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to go back and leave this code up for a little bit. This isn't going in this method. It's another method. So get outside of our configure method here and add that private method. The reason why is I'm going to show you one more extension, not an extension method, one more method on this interface, and then I'll show you a blog post where you can learn about all of them. And then we'll switch over to probably how you're really going to want to do this when you actually write middleware. This shows you how the middleware works, but in reality, there's some issues with this middleware that we'll get to. So are we good to move on from this little app.use? Not trying to rush anybody. And the whole thing is repeatable, I hope. If I do repeat it from GitHub, I'm gonna be very happy. And if not, then we'll update GitHub. That's what's the great thing about it. All right, so let me add the method outside of public void configure. I'm creating my own private static method, and I used Alt-Shift-F again to format it. I made up this name, handle mapped route, but it does need to be a method that returns void and takes an iApplication builder. That's something map requires. I'll tell you what map is in a second. Then what you do in this method is you finish off a pipeline. It could be more app.uses, more app.runs. So what that means is the map method allows you to branch. You could branch based on what you're going to see right now is the map method that we're about to call branches off of a route, but there is another method called map when that branches off of any condition. It takes a predicate, just like a lot of link expressions, or basically a function that returns true or false. And so it calls that function, and you say, oh, yeah, this is the route you want to take. So that, if you were wondering, like, well, I have this pipeline, but sometimes might want to go left or right based on user roles or environment, I don't know. That's what map when and map can allow you to do. Map is just a little more basic. It only works on a route. We haven't actually implemented map yet. We just created the method for it to call, and the next step in the GitHub repos just says to go add app.map after the Philly.net response header. So I'm going to leave this up for a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to back the code off a little, and then I'll zoom back in, just so we can see what's happened here. Let's kind of look at it all in context. Here was startup.cs. configure is your pipeline. We added a step to the pipeline, app.use, where all we did was sneak in and add a little header, and then we allowed it to continue. Then I created a new method and the reason I need that method is right after app.use, I'm going to use that little bit of code, the next step in the process, app.map. And I told it, when somebody asks for /mapped route, go call that function. That's where you want to head off. And I'll zoom back in. Does anybody need it zoomed out to see the whole context, or zoomed in is good? So all we've done now is we've used the base, just the base methods in iApplication Builder, which is your pipeline builder, to build the pipeline. We've used use, which is the one you use most often, quite frankly, because it's the one most of the time you're creating middleware that's going to call, it doesn't know where it's coming from and it doesn't know where it's going. That's the best way to write your middleware. And like, you know, as we're sitting here kind of waiting to move on, you know, what's a good use of middleware? Well, you can see that you could step into the pipeline and write some kind of universal logger, log every request. You know, maybe I've got an application with some MVC and some SignalR and even some WebAPI and it's all in one. I want to log everything that comes in. Or there might be certain super special requests that we don't do on this server. I mean, I don't know, that's... Sometimes at first it can seem like, well, what do I do with this stuff? And I would say that the 2 points is one is you could have a special use case, and the second is if you kind of understand how it works under the hood, using the rest of the framework should be easy. So has everybody tried running this now that we did app.map? I'm going to try running it real quick, and if I have to come back to the code, let me know. The map method takes the route as a string that you want to intercept, and did I ever stop this? Okay, so I got to rebuild it. So it'll do that for me. Also could do .NET build from the command line. The recycle button works as well, absolutely. Now it doesn't look any different because I didn't go to the route. Oh, yeah, thank you, Rob. See, it doesn't look any different because I didn't bring the Edge browser over. But it doesn't look any different going to the default route. But if I use the mapped route that was called for in our pipeline, I get my new response. I went a different direction. I took a fork in the road. Now, the step before in the pipeline, here it is, mapped route, still gets a chance to put in the header. Still got that opportunity. So let me see if we discussed this. Yeah. So before we move on to reusable middleware, can have a little bit of fun here. What this blurb of text is telling you is, what if you tried changing the order of this stuff? If you just took app.map, and I'm going to use Alt up arrow to move it up. What if I moved it here so that it went first in the pipeline? And after it was app.use. Does anybody know, first off, before I tell you what's going to be different about this? Okay, so what's going to be different is when map gets called, we've got to jump in our brains over to handle mapped route. No, it doesn't take a delegate here. So we can't like put the code in line. And this is calling app.run, which, if you remember correctly, let's even look at the explanation for it. Adds a terminal middleware delegate Well, that sounds like the end. It also doesn't get the next handler, so you can't pass it along if you want to. So this is what's called short-circuiting the pipeline. This code's never going to happen as long as we call the mapped route. We're never going to add that header as long as we call the mapped route. Really important distinction, because if we don't call it, we'll move along. So all I did here was move the app.map line up a few lines. Is everybody able to do that? And then go ahead and run it, and you should see the two different options. It looks the same on the outside, but you go examine the headers, and if you examine them on the mapped route, as long as I haven't screwed up here, then you will not see the Philly.net header. Is everybody able to keep up with this? Cool. I hope that's a yes. So I'm back up just a little bit for some context here. Comes in to configure. This time it's app.map to branch away. This branches off, fork in the road. If not, we're going to end up here at use and return next, which gets us to hello world instead of the hello from mapped route. Let's try those real quick. Let's bring up, let's see, which one did I get? Okay, cool. So here's my hello world. I'll run it again, and I'm going to bring up the dev tools. And when I don't use the mapped route, because the map function was saying, hey, I only run on /mapped route, I get my header. But because I changed the order of it, this is it. This is a let's find out. Let's find out if he knows what he's talking about. Mapped route, the header doesn't show, because just by changing the order, we have short-circuited, gone around that use statement. The map call went to a terminal piece of middleware. It's going to end there. Why is that important? You'll learn that as you're beginning to layer your middleware and you're using the built-in stuff, there is some ordering concerns over when you do authentication or when you do use static files. You do use static files very, very first, and you meant to do some authentication before that. It's not going to happen. It'll happen after. And this is a good way to play with that stuff. So this is not how you're going to write your own middleware components. How do I run it? Okay, so in Visual Studio Code, you do have to have the C# extension installed. Without that, Visual Studio Code, it's kind of funny, right? Visual Studio Code comes pre-installed with Node debugging support, and that's it. Yeah, Node.js, right. We got to go out and get C# support. So definitely, when you open up this project, it actually should recommend this to you. It should say, hey, I think you're working on a C#. It didn't do that? Oh, that's a bummer. Come on, Visual Studio Code. It should do that, and then you do have to have this installed, and that enables me to just, it's like I'm in Visual Studio, right? And that enabled this. Okay. So we're going to skip part of this lab because the next part basically creates the piece of middleware that we're going to do in a reusable fashion, but it does it as a delegate again, and that's going to add, we'll spend another 5 to 10 minutes on that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create middleware in its own class. This would be something reusable. You could put it in a NuGet package. And the standard procedure is to take your middleware, expose it as a class, and then add extension methods so that they get used in the same fashion, the way you do when you say app.useMVC, app.useSignalR, or as you'll see a little bit later, it's going to be useMVC in order to get WebAPI support, which, not that that's confusing or anything. So it'll be okay for us to jump ahead to creating this class. we're going to create, and I'll show you how to do this in Visual Studio Code if you're unfamiliar with it. We're going to create a file called request culture middleware. This little piece of middleware is just going to let us change the culture in your web session, in your web context. This is really not, this is cheating. This is not good code. Don't go to production with it. But it was something that I found I could do in a minimal number of lines of code that was a little bit more than just, well, first I wrote this and then I wrote that. So first thing is that we need to, I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to stop debugging. And if I go up to this top Explorer icon in Visual Studio Code in the upper left, I have all the files again. And we're going to add a new file now. So this is reusable code now. This could have been in a NuGet package. And I get that by clicking the plus sign on the little piece of paper looking thing, the new document. And I wanted to call it request culture middleware. If you don't call it exactly this, it'll be fine. That's just the convention of calling your CS file by the same name as the class. Now, there's a little bit more code here, so we're going to look at it in GitHub. Your class is going to get called with the delegate for the next function. So you've got to provide a constructor that takes that delegate. And it's a good idea to hang on to that delegate because it's your responsibility to call it. So that's exactly what happens in the constructor here. That delegate's coming from the pipeline. It's just being grabbed. It's just being hung on to. Read-only version of it. Then you provide a method called invoke or invoke async. It used to be invoke only, but now in 2.0, .NET Core, ASP.NET Core 2.0 or later, you can do an async version. And so this is just showing that you can use async and return a task. You get the HTTP context, which makes sense because you're going to act on that. And then after you're done acting on it, it's your responsibility to call next. So that's all that's happening here. This part of the code is the dummy logic to get us through. We're going to look at the query string, and if somebody supplied a culture, which is like a language, so NO for Norwegian, ES for Spanish, we're just going to set it on this pipeline. We're going to say, oh, guess what? This browser is Spanish. It's not really, but that's okay. We'll retrieve that value in a second and prove that we did it correctly. So all I have to do is from our GitHub repository, from the README file, copy and paste this file. So it's a little bit more code for us to just type out. In order to write your own middleware, you got to jump through a hoop that's just big enough that I'm hoping everybody here can cut and paste this. Okay, now by itself, that's good. That works. But this isn't generally how people build apps in the pipeline. If I go to startup.cs and I just say here, just explore a little bit, and I say like use MVC, see use MVC or use authentication, right? Use cookie authentication. This is how ASP.NET Core developers are being conditioned to look for new middleware is by extension method. So let's create an extension method. You could just create it right in here. In my instructions, I have us creating it in another file. So I'm going to continue doing that. I'm going to create the file, and I ask for it to be called request culture middleware extensions. So I'm cutting and pasting that, just pasting that file name out from GitHub. Paste that in, and then I've got to paste in my extension method class. And this is standard extension method. And I'm going to go ahead and bring it into Visual Studio Code so we can take a look at it. Let's see if Visual Studio Code wants to fix it up. Yeah, it did. So what is the extension method for to make this sort of method? Well, first of all, you're creating an extension method on iApplication Builder because that's the pipeline interface. So I need to return it. I need to return it and pass in, this is the extension method syntax, right? You put a this keyword in front of what you're extending. What you do is you call the use middleware method on iApplication Builder, and you pass it the type that you want it to use. There are some other methods. This one's pretty common, but this is the magic. This is the way that you create your own cool looking extension method for your awesome reusable middleware that you might put in a NuGet library so that people aren't creating delegates in line in the startup. And it's total madness because it's getting copied everywhere. So we have our middleware extension that's going to give us a use request culture method. And we have our little piece of middleware that just looks at the HTTP context and plays a little game with the culture info. Not nearly as important as getting this part right, which is, I'm going to go ahead and throw this stuff away. I don't need it because the only thing I want in my pipeline is use request culture. Is that what it was called? Now, you might notice that use request culture, it's complaining about it. So some of you, if you already figured out the reason is missing using statement. Well, this new middleware that I created is in a new namespace, philly.net.culture. And I'm not using that here, but hey, Visual Studio Code to the rescue. Just like Visual Studio. So now it's going to be up here now. There it is. So this feels more like ASP.NET, right? ASP.NET Core. You create a nice looking extension method that goes out, calls the middleware, and the middleware is being invoked just as if you call .use. Now, I'm not really doing anything with it. Like if you ran this right now, the middleware would actually run, but you don't get any nice result. So if you check the next step in GitHub, it's saying, oh, did I not include this? See, I gotta fix this. Oh no, I did, because we skipped this part. So I apologize. You have to go up out of our section here, and you want to find this part where it says if you run the application now, the middleware is part of the pipeline. Instead, we want to change the app.run block. We want it, and what we're doing is we're just changing it to go display the culture that we just set. That's all we're doing, just so we can prove that it did something. So you're right. If you were following along, we skipped and we came to here, creating a new file, request culture middleware.cs, and then create the extension method, add it to the pipeline. This is what your final startup CS looks like, and what wasn't clear because of the skip is that this is our final change. So if you run through this tutorial again, you'll see there's this intermediate step where we create the culture, this fake culture middleware as an inline delegate, just like we did earlier, to kind of smooth the transition. So I'm going to copy the app.run. Get this paste in here, and little squigglies come up. It says, well, I don't know anything about the culture info. I don't know anything about that. Oh, yes, you do. Yes, you do. Using system.globalization. Oh, yep, I do. I do know. If you are wondering what that is, just so that the code doesn't seem like magic, is this is a static method that sets the culture for the thread that you're on. So, because it's the kind of thing where like that doesn't change in an application. And a lot of pieces of an application probably want access to it. So instead of passing variables around, it's kind of like a singleton, right? It's when you set current culture, it gets set for the thread, an object that represents the culture used by the current thread, and then anybody can just go interrogate it. So in my middleware, I set it, and in our final app where I'm calling run, let's go write it out. Let's write out the display name. So I'm going to hit Alt-Shift-F just to get it nicely formatted, and I'll hit start the debugger, and we'll see where our web browser comes up. Okay. Now I didn't do anything, so the default is English US. That sounds good because I didn't do anything special. But what this middleware does is it looks at the query string. In fact, I've actually forgotten exactly what it looks at. So let's go look at the middleware. It looks at the query string, the context request query string, looking for a culture parameter. Okay, I can do that in the URL. Let me come back up to here and say culture. And I'm going to do NO for Norwegian. So question mark culture equals NO. That NO is getting passed to system.globalization stuff. It's magic. And it says, oh, that's Norwegian. And then when I come back around in app.run and read it out, but I get the fancy name, the nice looking name, I don't want NO, I want Norwegian. I don't have a lot of these memorized, but I did memorize that ES is Spanish, and I'll bet you FR is French, right? And then, you know, D, German. Awesome, thank you. And then, I mean, you know, I bet you we can. Russian, Italy. So that's just proving that I can create a piece of middleware that went in and took an action that then mattered for the rest of the application. Anybody else in the pipeline going and looking for that culture is going to say, oh, I guess somebody said it for me. I don't know who. So notice a key thing when you're writing these pieces of middleware. They're very abstract. They're very ignorant, right? They don't know who calls them, and they don't know who they're calling after. One thing that's not being shown here is that you are free after you've called the delegate. This doesn't have to be returned, by the way. I'm going to change this code. You don't have to. This is a response logic. You can write more code here because you're passing yourself on to the next one, and as it's wrapping back, as finally you hit the end, then the ASP.NET pipeline constructs a response, and that response is getting constructed by coming back through the other direction. And you could take a look at it and say, hold on a second. We add a header that represents the server that created this for debugging purposes later. We always add that header. So let me have a little piece of middleware that checks out what server I'm on, whatever its code name is, and adds that to the middleware coming back so that later when we have a problem in the field, we could say, oh, well, we know exactly what machine that was. Do not evaluate that sample middleware for its security implications. That was just an idea. So, did everybody get to do this? Yeah? A lot of people get stuck? I hope not. I do sincerely hope that you can come here and follow this instruction and do this again. Not only do this again, but there's some other cool stuff if you come here. After doing this whole section on routes, you can read the blog post about it. And after doing the reusable middleware part, you can read a blog post about it. And when you're all done, come to the bottom, and I've got what I think are some pretty good links to really expand your understanding of middleware. So one-stop shop here at github.com/philly.net, Philly, D-O-T-N-E-T. Make sure you get the middleware lab from today and just read this README. Tell us what you think of this. This is kind of experimental. Not only letting you do stuff cut and paste here, but I really have learned a lot about the idea of people, you follow the lab here and then you get to go home and do it again and then maybe get some resources about it. Let us know what you think. It's kind of what we're working towards. So 10 till 7 should leave you enough time, right? So I think as we switch here, we're going to take a little break. Feel free to take a bio break, and thank you all very much. Hope that helped. Yes. Right. So the question was, what are some other uses for this? And your example, which I think is really good, is instead of we focused a lot about on the way in, but what if on the way out, code that you would write after next, you might log exceptions that come back. And they're already, if you take a look at the use, the two, there's two pieces of middleware that deal with exceptions. One is meant for developers because it shows the blue screen, now the blue screen of death. And the other one, it's a piece of exception handling that throws up the generic error page. And you can configure that. Now, this is stuff that as you learn ASP.NET Core, you'll run across these modules. The trick is what I'm telling you is, and I think what you're catching on to is well, what if I can't use the baked module for this purpose and I want to write my own? That's what this is for. I agree that it's a good, it demos well, but then you start to think like, well, what are the cross-cutting concerns? And those can be a little hard to imagine, but I have a feeling as we begin to build more and more projects, we'll not only see middleware pop up that's reusable, you may not actually end up writing a piece of middleware. By the time you get around to doing it, you might say, oh, well, look, somebody's got an OAuth authenticator. I'm just going to use that. I mean, Microsoft has one. Yeah. Yeah.
I couldn't find good examples. They kept on saying like you're on your bit right now, and I didn't know what to get.
Yeah. So in the previous framework, a lot of us used Elma, which was an awesome in the .NET framework, ASP.NET 4. You just installed it, forgot about it, and it gave you great stuff. So yes, this is the technique, is using the pipeline. I mean, just being completely honest, I think what most of us really want to do is go find components people have already written, either the ones that are in the box from Microsoft or what's the library that's being built online. But I do think if you understand how it works, if the mystery of what happens next, because we didn't go super deep, but we kind of went the one next step. Okay, I did this use MVC thing. What is it doing? And why did I do use static files and then use MVC? And then what's this? How does this? So at least you're kind of seeing it bounces one way, bounces back.
I was doing like a second report post about something, and it did say like, hey, the order is important. I didn't know why.
Yeah.
Now I know why.
Yeah, the order is important because the request goes in, hits the terminal endpoint, comes back out the other direction. So, and you can have some fun with it. Like you can sit there and make some fun modules that this one short circuits and this one, messes with responses on the way back out. Like when I was kind of preparing for this, I had some fun where I had a module that wrote that Philly.net header. I had a piece of middleware, and then I had another one that specifically looked for that header and removed it. So it was like a search and destroy on the way back out. And again, I think a lot of it is just helping to understand, demagicify, I'm going to make that word up on purpose, the framework. And it still might come in useful. I think a lot of us are learning how to build apps on this. In the last year or two, we may have built our first apps, and they may be the small ones. And as time goes by, we're going to start building these enterprise ones, the ones that we want to live a long time, and maybe we'll find good, better uses. I'm not trying to say it won't work. Thank you. But no, those are good questions. Thank you.
Uh-oh. Pardon me? Well, how about we wait a couple more minutes just to make sure everybody's here, and then I can start answering the questions. All right, so let's get started again. So you had a question, and if I could paraphrase it, it's what's different about this than the other one? What do you gain by .NET Core Web API as opposed to the old Web API? Is that what you're asking? Okay. So when they redid the code, when they recreated and they created .NET Core Web API, they consolidated a lot of the stuff. So in the framework, you had MVC, and you had all the routing that went with MVC. And then they added on a whole nother library for API. So they're not exactly the same in the framework. They're really, really close, but they're not exactly the same. And what they did here is they sort of combined everything together and made it one library for everything. And yes, it is a little faster because you can run it on anything you want. So that's a nice thing too. So if you're going to do stuff like the big buzzword now is microservices and stuff like that. You could stick this on AWS or Azure or wherever you want to put it, and just have it much smaller than having to create a full-blown IIS, Windows server running, all that stuff. So that's basically what the biggest difference is. As far as the code goes, you get a little. They enhanced it a little bit. They're still working on it, so we'll see how much more they're going to add to it. But for tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to do this tutorial right here. And if we have enough time at the end, I want to do the next one, which is to include Swagger into this stuff. And hopefully we'll get to that. And if not, if we don't have time to do it as a hands-on, I'll go through it real quick and you can watch and then you can go home and try it yourself. So if everybody makes sure they get to this site, and this is it, create a web API with ASP.NET Core and Visual Studio Code. Make sure you're on the and Visual Studio Code part because that's what we're going to be using. We're not using Visual Studio for the Mac or for PC or for anything else. We're going to use Visual Studio Code. All right. So in the beginning of this thing, it shows you, beginning of this tutorial, just telling you what we're going to be creating. It's basically just a little to-do app. That's the typical API, website kind of thing that we're doing. There's some prerequisites. Make sure you have .NET Core 2.1 SDK or later, which we talked about at the beginning. So make sure you have that. And I did put in the instructions on how you can find out the best way to find out what version you're using. You could use .NET version, but that just tells you that much. A better one, so that you can really see what you're using, is info, and that gives you a little bit more information about what's going on. Now, I do say you need 2.1 because there are some spots in here. When I was playing, I have a couple different machines. I was trying it on different ones, and some had older versions of .NET Core, and some had the 2.1. And that, yes, you do get different things showing up, and some things won't work if you don't have the 2.1 for what this tutorial is doing. So make sure you have the correct version. So assuming everybody has the correct version, just clear this out so everybody can see better. And can everybody see this, or should I make it bigger? Okay. I'm not hearing any. Okay, fine. Guess it's big enough. All right. So if we look at the instructions on the web page, what we want to do is we want to run some console commands again, and as Chris showed you, you can create a whole new solution and stuff right from the command line. So it's .NET new, and if you're going to use the Visual Studio Code a lot, you're going to get used to this command a lot because this is how you do everything. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to put it into a directory called to do API. So hit enter on that, and it should go out and say, okay, we're going to create that. And yes, restoring all the packages, it does all that nicely now. And now we should have a directory called to do API. Now, Chris likes to go to the directory and then open it up, but you can open it up right from here too. You don't have to actually go into that directory. If you type code to do API, it'll open up in code that directory so you don't have to do the extra step. Because, you know, we type enough, right? So after you do that, you should open up Visual Studio, and let me just make sure I get it over here and make sure I get it bigger. So hang on a second while somebody sent me this. Oh yes, you have to say yes to the install the, well, you want to install the C# extension. You also want to install the other stuff. And let me, Chris was doing it a different way. I'm going to show you this one too. There's a Windows Zoom level in here. Somebody sent me a message about this after the last month. Thank you, whoever it was. I don't remember. For which one? So it's just this top line up here, this .NET new WebAPI-O to do API, and then after that it's code space to do API, and that should get you into it. All right. So is that big enough, or do I make it bigger? I can make it bigger. How's that? Even better, right? All right, let's leave it like that. Okay. Boy, that's big. All right, so that's okay. We're good. All right, so we've done that. You've all said yes to the required assets, and as Chris said, that just adds that little extra launch stuff in there. Now, it tells you to run it and debug. I'm going to tell you don't do that just yet, and there's a reason for that. What I found is in this version of .NET, when you say I want a web API, it says, great, we're going to give it to you, but you know what? We want you to use HTTPS. So this line right here, line 43, will redirect anytime you try and get to HTTP 5000 to HTTPS 5001, which is fine and it'll work, but every time it does it, it's going to come and say, hey, this certificate's not good. Do you want to continue? And it's easier just to comment out this. You can either get rid of it or just comment it out. I was just commenting it out because it's easier that way. And once that's gone, when you run it, it'll just stay on 5000 and HTTP. So you might be wondering where that stuff is. And it's in, not there, it's in properties, launch settings, sorry. You don't have to look here if you don't want to. But basically, the way this works, you can see right here, it's got the application URL. We'll play with this a little later, but it's got both of them in there. So it's got the HTTPS for 5001 and HTTP. That's how it knows how to redirect to a 5001. But if we just take out that one line, it ignores everything and just goes to where you want it to go. So now, if you do run and hit F5, and it opens up and says, I can't do anything because that isn't there, but if you type in API/values into the URL, because that's the only endpoint we have, and hit enter, you should get something that shows up. And did everybody get to that point? Yes, good. All right. Now, Okay. All right. So there we go. So let's go back to the code. Okay. And it's, you know, like it's very confusing up here because this screen is on the left side of the screen, but you have to go to the right to get to it. So I keep getting lost on where I am. Should probably move that around. Okay. All right, so let's look at the project file, which is, you know, the nice thing about Visual Studio Code also is that you can just open up the project file real easily. I know you can also in the Visual Studio now with the newer stuff, but it should look something like this. And this is what they just want to point out to you to say, this is where everything comes from. Okay, so everything is included in here that would, including the entity framework for in-memory databases. Now before, what we had to do is we had to add an entity framework in like 2.0 or before 2.1. You had to add more stuff. So this includes everything that one needs. So we don't have to change anything in here, which is nice. So then what we're going to do now is we're going to add a model to our project here. And we're going to put that in a models folder, and we're going to do that now. So in the documentation, we want to come in here. We want to copy this, and we want to put it into a to-do item folder or file rather inside of a models folder. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and we want to add first a folder. So there's different ways you can do this. There's an add folder right up here. What I recommend though is that you make sure that you're not selecting anything before you do this. So select someplace off just to be on the safe side, because it can get real easy to create folders inside of folders where you didn't really mean to create them. So click someplace in the empty space, and then you can click the add new folder. And we're going to call this models. And then inside that, so that now you do want that highlighted. We want to create a new file. We want to call it to-do item. And they don't say this in the documentation, but make sure you add that .cs on the end. Because if you don't add the CS on the end, it doesn't know what kind of file it is, and you don't get, it doesn't look right. Okay. So once you have this set up, so you have the models and then the to-do item inside of it, then you want to copy the object, the model here, and you should just be able to hit the copy button over here and paste it in. And once it's there, you might want to just hit the Control S to save it if you don't have the automatic save turned on, just to make sure. So what is this? So this is our to-do item. We have an ID, we have a name, and we have an isComplete flag to tell us whether we've completed our to-do item or not. Okay. The name is, you know, what we're going to do. So it's really very, very simple. So everybody got that? Yes, 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 yes. No? Yes, yes. Good. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to add our context to the models folder. Okay, so in the documentation, we want to create our DB context. So it's going to be called to-do context. So another folder, and again, make sure you put the .cs on the end of this. Inside of our models folder, we want to create this file. So again, highlight the models folder, new file, and it's now my phone's going off. To do context.cs. And we want to paste in our context. Okay, so remember, we didn't have to include that Entity Framework stuff, but we are using it in here, Microsoft Entity Framework Core. And we're using it because it's part of what they gave us with the ASP.NET Core stuff. Now, everybody get this far? Now what we can do is use what we learned in the first class, and that is to go to Startup, and we're going to add some middleware, or configure some stuff anyway. Not necessarily add it, but I guess we do add it, don't we? Add DB context. So go to startup.cs. And up here in configure services, we want to add our service to this. And by the way, this is the other thing we want to do here. And this is something you'll see if you have an older version of .NET Core. This won't look exactly like this. This will just say add MVC. It won't have the extra stuff in the end, and it won't even know what to do about it because it's not part of the older stuff. This is where you'll get some errors if you try and make it look just like this one. So what we want to do is we want to copy the highlighted portions. So can you guys see the highlight on the screens up there? Yes, good. So there's highlighted portions, there's a using clause, two using clauses, and that service.addDBContext. You can just copy that in if you want to, or type it in. It's totally up to you. And what we're doing is we're saying, yes, we're going to add a DB context, and we're going to use an in-memory database for this. So we don't have to worry about creating databases and everything else. Now that also means that every time we run it, the database gets wiped out. So don't expect to save anything here, unless you want to run this all the time. Right? So that goes in there. And then there's two using clauses, which we can either get to by just highlighting this and clicking on the little light bulb and select using, because we need the Entity Framework Core. And on this one, oops, wait for it. Did I screw something up there? I must have screwed something up there. Why is that like that? Oh. Did I copy everything? Oh, that's because okay. Hang on a second. Let me go back here. Did I? Well, we'll just revert everything back and make sure that I only copy what I want to copy. You should be able to copy the whole thing too, but there. That's what I wanted. That looks much better. I was wondering where all the rest of the stuff came from. All right, so using to-do API models, our models, and then using framework, core, both those things should be added. Yes, wonderful, Control-Alt-F, and it should reformat, although it didn't do a very nice job because it's indented, but there you go. So this just says, all right, we're going to create a database. I need to get a DB context set up, and I'm going to use an in-memory database, and my in-memory database is going to be called to-do list. Now, if you want to make it look nicer, you can just copy the whole thing, and that's fine too, and it'll work either way. Should work either way. I've tried it both ways, and it worked for me. But your mileage may vary. All right, so now we are going to get into the meat of this, and we're going to add a controller. So this is the controller for the Web API, right? Just like an MVC controller, which we've talked about before. This one gives us an endpoint that we can hit when we want to go to the website. And this one's going to be called To-Do Controller. So we already have a controller. Just go back over here because you're not seeing that, are you? We already have, this is the controller we want to add, To-Do Controller. We already have a controller folder over here. So remember when we first started this up and we tried it out, we went to API/values. There's that values controller in there. You can leave it there. It's not going to hurt anything. But inside our controllers folder, we want to add our new controller, which is called To-Do Controller. And of course, just like in MVC, it's the name of the endpoint with controller at the end. Right. So, To-Do Controller.cs, make sure you put the .cs on. You don't know how many times I ran through this and I kept forgetting to put the darn CS at the end of that thing. And then you can paste in that code from the website. So there's a couple things at the top that are interesting to note. One is the route. So the way the routes work is so in this case, the route is going to be our URL/API/the controller name. Now, not the whole controller name. So it's just going to be API/to-do. Okay. And then the API controller piece there underneath it, that gives us a couple of extras into our controller, so we don't have to worry about things like certain 400 errors that show up or things like that. So we get those for free by adding this API controller piece to it. There's a couple other things it adds to it as well. The other thing we want to notice here, because .NET Core is really embraced dependency injection, right? So inside the constructor for the controller, we pass in our DB context into it, right? So that's always good to see. So all this controller is doing right now is just setting things up. So what we have to do is we have to add something that will actually do something when we hit this endpoint, because right now it's not doing anything. It's going to hit the endpoint, nothing's going to happen. You're going to say, what the heck's going on? So if you look at the next set of code, this part here is where we actually go out and we get some things. So that's where it's got that HTTP GET up there in the code. Got a couple of them. And this will define the endpoint. So if we just go to our URL/API/to-do, it's going to do the get all, because that one's the default one. Doesn't have any names on the or the signature doesn't have any parameters passed into it. And if we pass in an ID, it's going to do the second one. so we get a specific one, right? Because that's going to match the signature for that. So what's happening is every time you make a call, it takes what you put into the URL and says, what does this match in whatever verb I'm using? So when you usually just go to an endpoint, you're issuing a get command, right? So that's what we're doing. We're doing an HTTP get, and we're getting these things back. So what we want to do is we want to add this piece of code to the controller we just made. So how's everybody doing? Everybody following along okay so far? And which one? This one? The API controller attribute. That is because it should be coming from controller base, but you should have, what version of .NET do you have? No, you have to download it yourself, the latest .NET version. You can do it now. It doesn't take very long. Let me just go back here for a second. If you go here, from the meetup page, yeah. Yeah, I think it's 2.1. Yeah. I can wait for a minute or two. Now, you might have to go into your, since we're talking about this, and this is sort of what I mentioned at the beginning, a little bit about this. Let me just go back and look in the CS Proj. This is what it should look like for this piece of it. If it's got some version after it, you probably have the wrong one. And if you're pretty quick, you could just recreate the whole project, because we haven't gotten that far into it, and just start all over again real fast. Or you can try and finagle this to make it work the way you want. Okay, so let's go back to our to-do controller and make sure you've copied the code, the HTTP gets, and we're going to paste them in at the end of our to-do controller. So right down here. Paste that in. So real quick again, this is the default HTTP GET, because you know, it's got no parameters being passed into it. That's usually what you're going to do. You're going to say API/to-do, and this is what's going to run. So it's going to return our to-do items in the list. Okay. This one will execute when we call it with an ID. So API/to-do/some ID. We'll get this. Now this name equals to do, we're going to look at a little later, but that will help us out down the road when we get to the create stuff. So assuming we've gotten this far, you should be able to run the application. Everybody get this far that was able to follow along? So if I start this up with an F5, and we go to API / to do, we get back something. We get back our to do item, the default one. Notice that it's in an array, and if I let's see, do I have? Hang on. No. Oh well. Close that up. I do not have Chrome on this machine. I don't have that one either. Oh well. So what you can see is it is an array because it's got the square brackets on the outside, and it's got in the curly brackets. Oh, jeez. Doesn't work. Yes. That wasn't what I wanted. If we call it with just the one, because there is one out there, then we just get the one value, right? So no square brackets around it because it's not a list, it's just an individual item. How'd we do?
So I guess wait, one damn question. Well, for most API calls that I've seen, it just return back specific data, right? But return back specific data. Like, as we're trying to follow my confidence there, but then there's some debate around like what happens like for example, if you pass in the one, what happens if the one isn't found? Like, how do you?
All right, let's find out. What happens if I pass in 2, which does not exist?
There's no indication of what actually what
Well, I mean, you can look up what the correct responses would be. In this case, 404 would be a correct response because it's not found, right? Inside your code, you'd have to handle that response back from a REST call. Here, it's just being displayed, but in the code, you could say, you know, what was my status, and go handle it that way. Okay? Because it is part of the URL, so in this case, you know.
But like I said, it's pretty standard just to return back specific data.
Well, this is just the data. Now,
That's what I mean. That's the specific.
Yeah,
That's pretty much it. That seems like something that's done with all the baseball sports.
Yeah. Right. That's basically what this is. So it's a JSON object that you know has the data in it. In this case, the data is ID of 1. Name is called item 1. It's really, you know. And is complete is false. So it got that. In case you're wondering where that came from, if you look at the controller up here, when we instantiate this controller, when we new it up, whatever, it's right there. We're creating a new to-do item called item 1, and because we didn't specify the Boolean value, it's going to be defaulting to false, and the ID gets built because we're using an in-memory database, so it says that's the ID field, and it's auto number. So that's not how it works. How do we do? People get this? People not get this? Let's move on. All right. So, if you follow through the rest of this little introductory here, we talked about some of this stuff already. The API controller, that's the routing. We talked about the signatures for this stuff. Again, we'll talk about that later. And that's pretty much it. Now, we can go through this if you want. And that's fine. And we probably need to do a few of these pieces here just to make the rest of it work. So, what I want to do, because we're running a little short on time, let's skip to, we're going to skip the actual UI piece of this, which isn't really that exciting anyway. I can tell you that. And jump down to where it says implement the other CRUD operations. So this, jump down to this section here. Now there's a couple of things here. There's going to be a post, there's going to be a put, there's going to be delete. Those are the sections of the code that we're going to be working with. So, everybody get down to this part? What we're going to do is we're going to add this code to our controller. So copy this create method and paste it in after the gets. And Control-Shift-F to move it over. Now, the interesting thing to see here is what this does is it allows you to create a to-do item, okay, which is what you want to do. It adds the item, saves the changes, and then down here, it creates a route with the get-to-do name. And it's getting that from up at the top where there's a get. So what it's doing is it's creating a URL for you to be able to get that item you just added back in, back out again. Okay, so that's where that name comes into play. And it makes it a little easier so you don't have to worry about doing that stuff yourself, because that's usually what you end up doing is, right, you go in and you make a create something, you have a couple of options what you can do when you return the values. You're probably going to return the object back again, but then you'd have to then parse that out and figure out, well, what's the URL for, what's the ID for that thing and get all that stuff. So what this is doing is it's just basically saying, hey, I'm going to give you a URL based off of your URLs, the way you've got things set up, and it's going to have the ID of the most recently added item stuck in there. Which I think is pretty cool. Now we're going to skip a little bit again. And when you go home, you can open this back up again. You can follow through the rest of the tutorial. But I want to skip because the next section is about Postman. How many people here use Postman? Yes, good, wonderful. So what Postman, for those who don't use it, allows you to do is to make API calls without having to set anything else up. Right. So it's a nice little interface. You can make the API call, and you can set up the headers, the body. You can change what kind of call you're making. So in this example, they're showing you here, they're doing a post. See up here in this left-hand corner, they've got this little post drop down. And you can do a post, a get, a put, delete. There's a bunch of other ones you could do. You can set up the body, you can set up the headers. So if you want to test out your authentication, you could do that through this as well. And it's free and it's easy to use. And, you know, that's what's part of the tutorial. What do other people use besides Postman? I know we use Wrestlet is one. We use Wrestlet. Soap UI is another one. Yeah, there's a bunch of them out there. This one, they've actually pulled it out. It used to only be in Chrome, and now they pulled it out and made it a standalone little application. Fascinating stuff. So what you can see, let's see, is it showing in here? Yes. So down here, it's showing you what happens when you do a create. So you do a post, you put it in there, and then down here you get that URL that was created. So let's quickly go through and add the update to our code. And, you know, update does what you'd expect it to do. And update's usually done with puts. So when you create something, you usually do a post. When you update something, you do a put. That's how it works. We don't have to go through the code for this, but just know that it's there. And in a little bit, we'll be going through the code. Now, delete. Delete is an interesting one. There are some places that will block deletes. Just forget about it. You can't do it. And I think that more has to do with some legacy problems with Apache, but some companies still just block deletes because they don't want you to do it. So sometimes you have to get special dispensation so you can run a delete command, even though it's a standard verb that you want to use. So the delete takes an ID and it'll just go through and delete something. So let's copy that in real quick. And the reason why I'm trying to get through this is because I want to get to Swagger. At least I'm hoping I'm going to get to Swagger. And it helps if we have all these pieces put in when we run our Swagger. Okay. And if you don't get all these things in, it's not critical. You can still get to the Swagger stuff. Okay, so that's the end of this one. There's a link down here at the bottom that says ASP Core Web API pages using Swagger. So assuming give everybody a chance to catch up, assuming you get some of those things in there that you want for update, delete, all that stuff. So we have basically at this point a completely functional, theoretically, to do API that we can call if we wanted to. So I'll just open this up in a new tab just because that's what I like to do. So how many people here have heard of Swagger before? Okay, good. How many people use it all the time? Right? Yeah, good. How many people have not heard of it before? Okay. How many people have heard of SOAP before? Okay. So you can think of this basically as the REST version of SOAP if you want to. It's the easiest way to think of it. It's not really, but it's close enough. This is how you can pass around information about what your API does and how you can call it and what objects get returned from it without actually having to talk to anybody. And we know we don't really like to talk to anybody. So that's why we have these things. Swagger was the original name of it. It has been changed to Open API, although everybody still calls it Swagger. Either one works. They probably prefer you to call it Open API, but hey, do what you want. So this is an example of a Swagger document. So it's giving you the paths to the endpoints what operations what responses you're going to get back, what objects you're going to get back. All those things are defined inside this little JSON file. The other nice thing about Swagger is it gives you this. So when you install it in your application, in your API, it gives you an endpoint that you can hit with a UI in it. And that UI can actually execute the different endpoints that you've got inside your API. Pretty slick. I like it. Even very colorful, isn't it? The other thing that this does, and it doesn't show you in here, but this endpoint that has this nice little interface to it also has a link, which doesn't show up here, but we'll have a link to the JSON file that you can pull down. So if you go to a place that uses Swagger, you can go, get to their Swagger page. You can try out the different APIs if you want to. And if you want, you can grab that Swagger file and then you can use it inside your own application. So, how would we add this? Well, Swagger is the name, but we use Swashbuckle. Sometimes I wonder who these people are that come up with these names. To actually add it to our code. Now, Swashbuckle was available for the framework.net framework. I've used it in that version. It was a little bit interesting to get set up. This one is a little bit easier to get set up. There's a lot less involved with getting this stuff set up in here. So, inside this walkthrough, and I just wanted to get really this far because I wanted to point a few things out. One is we are using a Visual Studio Code. By default, it opens it up as Visual Studio. So this is the only tutorial I've found so far at Microsoft sites that has all of them in one tutorial, and you have to pick the right tab as to which one you're going to use. So make sure you're using the right one, and it's the one that says Visual Studio Code for us. Switch over to that, and it gives you the commands you want to execute. All right, so we can do this real quick and possibly get something done. So we want to open up, copy this command first, and we want to go back to Visual Studio Code, and we want to open up a terminal window. I know I can change the default one. Can you tell I don't use this one very much? So everybody knows how to get to a terminal window inside Visual Studio Code. It's Control backtick if you want the shortcut keys to it. And you want to paste in that .NET command. So what's this going to do is it's going to add to our CS_proj file the correct information so that we can get all the packages that are required for Swashbuckle. So it does a lot of stuff here. It does a lot of logging and does a bunch of other stuff and sets up a bunch of stuff. Usually comes up with you've got unresolved dependencies to make sure you restore them. And it does all that stuff, but it only puts one line into the CS_proj file. It's wonderful, yes. Because the way .NET Core works is it's a hierarchical structure. It doesn't have to show you everything it's got. It shows you the top level stuff. So make sure that you do a restore. Pardon me? Oh, command is this command here, .NET space add space to do API. Yeah, this one right here. It's inside the tutorial. And if we go into our CS_proj file, we can see what got added. There it is, one line. All that for one line. You could have just typed the one line. It does. You type the one line in, and then it says, hey, do a restore. It'll say, okay, fine, get everything, and does it. Or you can do the command at the bottom. Either way works. Okay, so now this again, we're going to go back to our startup, and again with middleware stuff, we're going to have services in this case. You have to register your Swagger generator, and this is the part that actually generates all that stuff. So now you can see what's so important about the middleware stuff that we talked about earlier is all this stuff is back there, and all you have to do is say, yeah, I want to use this. And this command is saying, I'm going to create a version 1 document, and the title is going to be my API, and that's all I need to do. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for right now, because we have like a couple minutes left, I'm just going to run through this real quick just so you can see what it looks like. You guys can go home and do this on your own. It's not that tough. And we'll see if we can get it to actually give us something, output something for us. Where did that go? Configure services, startup. That's the right spot for it. There is an include file or a using file, and that should do it. Okay. And startup, we have to make some changes. Configure. I just stick it here. And I just copied all this stuff. And what this is saying is this is giving us the endpoint for our Swagger JSON file. Okay, so if you hit this site, this endpoint directly, you're going to get that JSON file back with all the correct information in it. And what else we got? Let's see. I need to do that? I don't think I need to do it. All right. All right, that should be, it's the only one I don't know if I need or not. We'll just add it in anyway. Where'd that go? I'll leave that out for right now because I don't really need to care about that. All right, so we've got this set up. Let's give it a shot and see what we get out of it, if anything. All righty, good. There it is, okay? So I added those couple lines of code, wasn't much, right? And I get this, pretty cool. It's a miracle. It's a lot easier than the old way it used to be. I can tell you that right now. All right, so these things do actually work. So if we go in here, we can say, yes, you know, I want to try it out. And it will say, I can execute it. And it will go ahead and say, yeah, fine, there you go. And there's your output. Okay? All the output, including the response headers, right? It also gives you the curl command if you want to play with it that way. Okay, pretty cool. Up here, remember I mentioned that JSON file? Well, there it is, and I'm sorry I don't have a JSON formatter in this particular version of Edge, but you can't get one. I just don't have it installed on this one. there is all the information that would be required to to give to somebody else so they would know what they're doing when they hit your endpoints. So some things to look at is down here at the bottom. This is the object that gets returned, right? So it's the definition of the to-do item that gets returned. The other stuff that's in there is all the endpoint stuff. I could do that, but we'll be good now. Remember, we still had that values. I never got rid of that controller. So understand that it goes through and looks at all your stuff and tries to figure out what you're going to do with it, right? There are, and a little farther down in here, it explains how you can change the way this looks a little bit. You can give it more information. You can give little descriptions about what each of these endpoints are for and what they do. You can give information about what the return codes are. So in some of our examples that we didn't go through very thoroughly, but are in there, if you do a create, you're going to get back, or a delete rather, you're going to get back, I think, a 20 something. I can't remember what it is. 201. No content, something like that. Whatever that one is, you can put that in here and say, yes, when you do this, you're going to either get a 201 or you're going to get a 400. That's it. There are no other return codes. So that's the kind of stuff you'd put in here. This is really makes life a lot easier when you're doing stuff. And then down here at the bottom, it does go out and say, here are the models that get returned. So you can go to a site that's using OpenAPI or Swagger, whatever you want to call it, and you can find out all the information you want and try things out if you want to, assuming they let you do that. So there you go. That's the speed version of Swagger. But you can see how easy it is to create it, to stick it in your code. We added, how many lines of code did we add to this? We added some middleware stuff. We added we included some stuff in the project file, and that's pretty much it. So what are we talking about here? This line here and these down here. So handful of lines. That's all it took. And it went through and used reflection and go through all your code to see what's going on and generates all the output. That's all. So that is that's a good start for API stuff. So any questions? Well, we still have 2 minutes. Yes. We can look at it. I don't know off the top of my head. Probably. We just do a view source real quick here. I don't see. I don't know what it's using. Well, looks like it's got its own stuff. I'm sure you could dig into it a little deeper if you wanted to, but there you go. Knock yourself out. Any other questions? That's all I got. Is there more hoagies still out there they can go pick up and eat and walk away with? That's probably good.